can. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Terra Podcast. This is episode 27. For those of you who don't know me, I am a writer, a speaker, a trauma-informed coach. I'm also a professional toxic masculinity interrupter and feminist killjoy at your service. And today I want to talk about this week's National Day of Mourning, this day that colonizers and settlers call Thanksgiving. I'm also going to be talking about family trauma, disrupting toxic family cycles, cycle breaking, boundaries, chronic invalidation or traumatic invalidation, self-abandonment, and being the scapegoat, or what is known as the quote-unquote black sheep. But because of the racist connotations that are underlying that phrase, I'm going to instead use the phrase the odd sheep. So if you're interested, there's also an Instagram video that I've posted at the end of 2023 at this time about where I go into my experience with my family of Thankstaking and how I've approached it. And I offer some tips about how to navigate this genocidal holiday and how to navigate your family, how to navigate your feelings around this day. And I go into a little bit about my historically difficult relationship with my family. If you're watching the video of this, I'm going to be looking over to this side of the screen because I have notes written. And so if I'm looking over there, just know that that's me checking out my notes, because I want to make sure that I'm really doing this, the thoroughness and justice and quality that I know that this topic deserves. And of course, I won't be able to discuss all the ins and outs of the complexity of this topic in this episode, but I will be revisiting or going more in depth into certain topics that I touch on throughout this episode in future episodes. And of course, Terra Incognita Media as a whole is always dedicated to talking about ongoing colonization, the multiple genocides that are happening across the globe, and land back initiatives, and the ongoing impacts of the violence against Indigenous peoples throughout the past and into the present. So first, I want to acknowledge that I'm a settler on the stolen, traditional, and current lands of the Osage Nation, the Missouri, the Illinois Confederacy, and many other Indigenous peoples that have been stewards of this land for time immemorial. So I'm occupying land that is otherwise known as so-called St. Louis, Missouri. And I'm borrowing this land acknowledgement from Patricia Cleary's book, Mound City. Here it is. This is a book about St. Louis's Indigenous past and present. And this land acknowledgement that I'm borrowing from this book, from Patricia Cleary, the author, she adapted her land acknowledgement with permission from the Kathy M. Buter Center for American Indian Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. I just bought this book and I'm really excited to continue reading it. I'm really interested right now in doing a lot more research on the sacred mounds that were here in so-called St. Louis that were decimated and destroyed because of the city, because of the buildings that were built on top of these sacred sites. But what I also am always referring back to and continually revisiting and reading over and over again is this book, which is integral and foundational to my learning and understanding and my unlearning of being a white person and someone who has inherited the legacy of colonizer and someone who has benefited from ongoing colonization. This is crucial reading. This is called An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. This book has informed so much of my work, including the workshop Toxic Masculinity in the Outdoor Industry, and I cannot recommend it enough. I do want to offer a trigger warning that we are going to be discussing systems of oppression, genocide. We're going to define what genocide is, and I will be talking about trauma and how that shows up in our family systems and in the world. So please take care of yourself. If this isn't something that you want to engage with right now, prioritize your self-care, and that's totally understandable. We're in a time when genocides are being live streamed. Palestine, Congo, Sudan. Here in the so-called United States, we're still in the midst of genocides against Black people and Indigenous people. And contrary to what a lot of people understand, a genocide doesn't mean that the people have been entirely wiped out. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's website, quote, "The legal term genocide refers to certain acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Prevention and punishment of the crime genocide is an international crime, according to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide." And then it lists the acts that constitute genocide, and they fall into 5 categories. 1, killing members of the group. 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This day that we're coming up on, or if you're listening to this on the day of, it is Thanksgiving, or otherwise known as Thankstaking. It is a holiday rooted in genocide. It celebrates genocide. This day is built on the propaganda that this country was founded on generosity and sharing a meal with Indigenous people when the colonizers and the pilgrims first came to the shores of Turtle Island. This myth that we were in communion as settlers, as colonizers, with the original peoples of this land, when we know that that's not the truth. We know that that's not how things unfolded. And we know that the truth is one of violence, brutality, rape, pillaging, murder, and that this bleeds into the present so much still today. I've had a really long, confusing, frustrating, grief-stricken time figuring out how to navigate this so-called holiday with my family of origin. And the focal point of this episode will be on how difficult it is to navigate our family structures and relationships, and how sometimes what the best course of action is to just opt out. And that sometimes breaking the cycle of abuse or erasure or white supremacy in your family is just to boycott or opt out of these kinds of holidays, quote unquote, these kinds of acts of intentional erasure and violence towards Indigenous people. It was probably 2017 or 2018 when I first introduced and tried to do a land acknowledgement for my family. And like on Thanksgiving Day, I was a lot less emotionally mature and had way more of a finger wagging white person approach to doing this land acknowledgement and addressing the truth of this day with my family. And I basically read 10 pages from this book, from an Indigenous people's history. It was like spraying a fire hose in my family's face. And that was one approach. That was the approach I took at the time. And in hindsight, I mean, there's no way that I would have been able to do anything differently because that's where I was in my process of learning and unlearning. But over the years, I've realized that this really isn't the way to go. And there was pushback from my family. I've since gone to therapy. I've since learned how to more maturely communicate. I've since learned how to be more emotionally mature and how to regulate my emotions, and how sometimes as white people, when we're starting to unlearn our conditioning in white supremacy, we often co-opt Black rage or Indigenous rage, and then we project that onto our family or the people that are closest to us, and that isn't actually helping the situation at all. And so I've had to heal a lot of that in me over the years. And I've had to heal my inner child wounds as well, so that I could show up to family gatherings with more groundedness and clarity about how I want to approach these topics and how I can have the biggest impact and how I can show up in the most aligned way towards solidarity with Indigenous people, and having more discernment around what's worth my effort and what's not, how to go about trying to get my message across in a way that keeps me humble, that keeps me attuned to the fact that, yeah, it is my job as a white person to educate the white people in my life and to have these difficult conversations with my family. And also at the same time, you can't have emotionally mature conversations with emotionally immature people. But I really had to do a lot of my own maturing before I could get to a point where I'm discerning whether or not at this stage in my growth, am I communicating with emotionally mature people, or is my emotional maturity going to be met and reciprocated? And that's what I'm going to get into in this episode. So last year was probably my most emotionally mature approach. And I wrote this little mini speech. It was probably like up to 5 to 8 minutes long. And I wasn't coming from a place of attacking. It was written with so much love and compassion and education, from the opposite of a finger wagging white person way. And I was pretty proud of myself for getting to this point where I could communicate this. And it was a culmination of a lot of healing on my part. And my little brother gave me his stamp of approval, and I feel like that really says something. But what ended up happening was that there were still some family members that didn't appreciate me going so long, and they told me that it was way over the time limit that they had given me because I was given a time limit. And so it really devolved into this conflict, and it was awful. It ended up being really awful between me and some of these family members. And despite me feeling like I was bringing this beautiful offering, and I had all this hope that my family truly cared, and that if I just said these things in the right way, or if in the most compassionate way, without losing the necessary accountability in my words for our participation in white supremacy, and the accountability that I strive to have in my own life, and trying to get that across to my family members, just to pick up their end of the accountability that they need to practice, I was met with these impossible shifting goalposts about how to approach bringing this truth to this day, and just generally overall trying to engage my family in a healing process around our participation and complicity in white supremacy and in ongoing colonization. And so after that, and after the aftermath of that, I have, processed it. I've been talking to my therapist, and then the topic, of course, comes back up around this time, because I'm like thinking to myself, like, am I going to go this year to my family's dinner or not? And I have 4 siblings, and they have kids now. They have children, and they're all like 7 and under. And then we have like neighbors or family friends that join us. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, I don't want to go this year, is what my gut was telling me, is just do not go. And I came across this post from an anti-racist educator, and I'm blanking on this person's name now because it was just something that I saw as I was scrolling. And this Black anti-racist educator was talking about how she had come across a white person asking for advice in this, like, I think it was like some kind of like an ally group, white person ally group for, being anti-racist. And this white person was like, hey, check out this text from my family. Like, the text was something like, we're not allowing like woke conversations to be happening at our like Thanksgiving this year or anything like that. And so this white person was like, what shirt should I wear to this gathering if we can't talk about anything, like, And the point that this educator was getting across is that this is such a passive aggressive thing for us as white people to do. And they were making the point that this white person should just not go, like that boycotting and not participating and not attending this family tradition, this gathering, is the best way to go. Because why would you socialize with racist people, with people who are so adamantly against anything progressive, so adamantly against anything that is for the betterment of humanity? Why would you go and be around these racist, blatantly white supremacist people and family members? And the point also was that, like, it is something for us as white people to consider, that how are we living into our values? And sometimes, like, there are certain relationships that we have with family members that there needs to be a line drawn, or there needs to be a cutting off or a boundary. And that's something that I've been sitting with and thinking about. I don't, in my life personally, from what I'm deciding for myself, is not that I'm going to be in a place right now. I don't feel the need to be completely cutting off family members at all. I do feel like my family is ultimately loving. I do feel that there is a way in which at times I can show up and be my authentic self. And I am choosing to be in a certain kind of relationship with people in my family. I want to maintain my relationship with them. I do love my family. And I'm in this process of grieving the ins and outs of how I want to show up. And that's an ongoing process. And I also have my little nibblings now. And I very much deeply, desperately want to be a part of their lives forever. And I want to be a good auntie to them. And I want to be present in their lives in the ways that my aunts, in the ways that I wish my aunts would have been there for me. And I want to play that role in their lives. And so I'm desperately trying to navigate and be conscientious of the fact that if I want to be in their lives, I have to navigate my relationships with my siblings in a way so that I can continue to be in their lives. And so that's just something I'm always grappling with. And so anyways, at the same time, I was thinking to myself, it doesn't necessarily make sense for me to keep going to this gathering if I'm continually coming up against these barriers and these walls with my family members who continue to show me that they want nothing to do with me speaking truth into the space. And granted, I've admitted that there have been times in the past that I've shown up and done these land acknowledgements or have shared a piece of truth in a way that I regret, that my approach wasn't in the way that I would necessarily do today, that I would change the ways that I've approached bringing the truth to this day to my family. I would change the ways that I've done that, and that I regret that. I have apologized and said, I don't agree with the ways that I've approached this in the past, but I do want to, that was what I said this year, was that ultimately I ended up telling them in a group text that I love you all. This used to be my favorite holiday because it was seemingly the only holiday that didn't revolve around consumerism. Now as an adult, I know better. And now as an adult, I know the truth of this day. And we all know the truth of this day. And it is a deep grief and sadness in me that over all these years, I have been the only one to bring up the truth, to put any effort into evolving our tradition, updating our tradition. I've struggled with feeling seen and heard and validated by the family when it comes to this, that this is something that is deeply important to me, that is integral to my morals and my values. And it continues to be a point of contention. And I continue to be demonized and villainized and ostracized and made to feel like the problem when I'm trying to bring this up. And on top of that, it is deeply saddening to me that I'm part of a family that isn't prioritizing this, that is happy to just say things like, well, we're not celebrating genocide. We're just getting together as a family, and we do care about what happens or what is happening to Indigenous people, but we are just gathering to give thanks and be with family on a day off. And it's to me, I had to say in response to that, but it is an erasure if we're not actively engaging with the truth, and if we're not incorporating a meaningful acknowledgement, and if we're not meaningfully engaging with the truth of this day and altering, updating, evolving our tradition and how we gather. It doesn't feel good for it to just be this offhand, okay, let Erin do her 1 to 2 minute acknowledgement and then we'll get back to eating and go about our night. Doesn't feel good to me. It feels like an appeasement. It feels like, oh, this is just something Erin does and she has to do it and we have to deal with it and put up with it. I personally don't want to be part of something like that. I don't want to be in a family system that treats something that's meaningful to me as something that is just something they have to appease. And I don't want to be included in a family tradition that is perpetuating erasure and violence, ultimately. Because erasure is violence. I don't want to be part of a family system that isn't willing to grapple with uncomfortable truths that we're complicit in. And so that's something that I had to come to terms with and tell them that even if they were willing to give me a 1 to 2 minute time period to give a land acknowledgement, it doesn't really feel like a win. I also was asked, I also would have to send what I'm going to say to one of my siblings, and that feels incredibly infantilizing. It doesn't feel like true engagement or care or a mutual honoring of the truth. So I talked about this in depth with my therapist a couple days ago, and my advice to you as somebody who's listening to this and considering your own family dynamics and how to approach this day is to talk to a therapist, talk to a trusted friend, really dig deep into the past few quote unquote holidays and figure out if it's really an emotionally safe space for you to be in. And maybe like your lack of presence will speak volumes as opposed to you going. Because I thought about it and I'm like, yeah, like, I mean, I always thought like, okay, at least like being there and somewhat like at least just offering a small acknowledgement is better than nothing. Like doing that is better than nothing. But talking to my therapist, I was like, well, but if they're not really listening or if they're not really internalizing this message and they're only giving me these 2 minutes and then we're just going to go about our night and then I have to continue to mask and continue to have small talk as if I'm happy and then just like happily go along with all the adult small talk. I mean, most of the time that I'm at family gatherings, I'm hanging out with the kids because I love being around them and they're the best. Like they are the supreme people to socialize with at family gatherings. And obviously, I would rather spend all my time with the kids and play with them. And that's what I do. But in the midst of that, like having to pretend to be jovial and put on this mask and performance for these adults that a lot of these people that would be at this dinner like aren't actively engaging in anti-racism or unlearning their conditioning under white supremacy. I don't want to continue to put myself around people who aren't aligned with my values. Like, how does that even make sense? How does it make sense to, I came to the conclusion that me going to this event is really just for me to appease my family. And they're not really meeting me where I need them to meet me. Like I'm doing all of this work to maintain our family connection, to show up to these events where I have to put on a mask or I have to put on a performance. Or if I don't put on a performance, I'm met with, you're the villain, you're the dramatic one, you're the sensitive one, you're the problem. That's how I've been made to feel my whole life with my family. And I'm at this point exhausted. I'm at this point done with that. And to me, I've realized that that is a boundary that I need to set for myself to emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually protect myself from this energy and from these feelings of what I'm going to get into called chronic or traumatic invalidation, and start to just bring that energy back to myself and channel it into the spaces and people and activities that are really meaningful for me and that reciprocate the energy that I want to receive. And that means to me that instead of going to Thankstaking, I'm going to go visit the Cahokia Mounds and do reading about the indigenous history of St. Louis, of so-called St. Louis, and talk to my friends, go outside and honor this day in the ways that I can. Donate to indigenous organizations. Something that is always kind of lingered in the back of my head too, and why I have tried and tried and tried to continue to put myself in these situations with my family and be the quote unquote disruptor and have chosen to like just accept and embody that role is that I worry about the kids and the babies. I worry about my lineage to be taught the truth and not to be complicit in these systems of oppression. And I guess one day when they're older, if things go the way that they're going and my family doesn't want to evolve and adapt this tradition particularly, then they'll explain to the kids like Auntie Erin isn't here because of this, or I'll have the conversation with them and they'll be like, why don't you ever come to Thanksgiving? And I'll say, well, this is why. I'll explain the truth to them. But until we can meaningfully change this whitewashed tradition, I told them that I can't in good conscience attend. This brings me to what I really want to get into of this episode, which is that through therapy, I've learned that I've been experiencing what's called, what I've mentioned already, chronic invalidation, and that I've been cast as the scapegoat or the odd sheep of my family. And if you're experiencing those things, then I want to help you to understand that so that you can have a clear idea of what's most healthy for you when it comes to navigating and understanding your family dynamics, or even in your relationships or friendships, because I realize that I'm conditioned to like these phenomenons or these like patterns of chronic invalidation, of being cast as the scapegoat. It has created a conditioning in me to self-abandon, to abandon myself. And it's the same way that I self-abandon in my intimate relationships and sometimes in my friendships. I put myself, my needs, my desires, my grief, my feelings aside to show up and prioritize what the other person needs, what my family needs, at the cost of my peace and my stability, my feelings of security. And I put on a performance that everything's okay, but it's not okay. And if you've had to carry that weight of performing for your family or your friends or your loved one it might be time to take that weight off. It might be time to put that weight down and to grieve the reality of the situation, because that's ultimately what I'm doing right now. Is I'm deeply, deeply grieving. I've been crying a lot and I'm in deep grief. This time of year always brings about grief for obvious reasons. And also I'm in a process of deep grief, which we always are uncovering deeper layers of grief, it seems, and the healing never ends. But I'm uncovering new layers of grief and connecting new things. And so it's a really grief stricken time. And my therapist ultimately was like, this is like, you just got to feel the grief. On the other side of that grief, at the same time, there's been this liberation, there's been this relief. Once I was able to work out with my therapist, like, yes, I feel good about telling them I'm not going to go. Like, there was so much relief and so much liberation in that. And the paradox of all this is that when I shared this with my family, my dad said, wow, that's like really sad. And we're sorry to hear that. And, we understand, but, maybe just sharing a little bit of something is better than nothing. And also, like, I had shared with them a couple videos about the truth of Thanksgiving. And I was like, here are these things to consider. And my dad said, I will watch these videos. And then I'm thinking about, sharing my own words of acknowledgement. And I was like, that's great. I'm so happy to hear that. And I was really appreciative that he's going to watch the videos, consider putting together some of his own words of acknowledgement for the day. And at the same time, I'm like, this feels like almost too little too late, or it feels like so much more sadness and grief in me, because this is all I've ever wanted my dad or a family member to say is, I will join you in this effort to acknowledge the truth of this day. And I'm sitting there, I mean, my response to him was like, I've tried to bring in a little bit. I've tried that, and it doesn't result in anything meaningful. It doesn't result in anything that is appreciation or like honoring of what I'm saying. Like, all I am met with is resentment and demonization and negativity. So like, I don't want to keep putting myself in that situation. And I want you all to understand how that has impacted me. And if you want to carry that torch, or if you want to say something, then that's great. But until this day fundamentally evolves, I can't be a part of it. And I mean, that to me is a little bit of a change. Like, sometimes when we set a boundary, it sucks in the moment, and it sucks and it's shitty for a little while, but it will ultimately shift things. Sometimes it might be for the better, sometimes it might be for the worse. I don't know how this is going to unfold, but I have the openness and the hope that next year it can be different. And that I have the hope that my family can grow and can evolve and can unlearn. And I see that in them. And it's just going to take a really long time, as it has. But as I've grown, like, my growth impacts our structure, our family systems. And as I'm breaking these cycles in myself, it is naturally going to disrupt the homeostasis or the norm within my family systems, like kind of like a ripple effect. When you stop participating in the system, it breaks, there's friction, and there's going to be some kind of a response. There's going to be a disruption in and of itself. So for me, it's the biggest disruption that I'm doing this year is just not going, which will arguably have the biggest impact. At least that's what it feels like this year for me. In our relationships, when we've been the one to continually do the work and invest ourselves and pick up all these pieces, and I find that, like, for those of us who have experienced these things of being the scapegoat or being chronically invalidated, we'll try to do so much to prove ourselves, or to do so much for the other person to appease them. And when we finally stop doing that, you might find that the other person will pick up the slack. They'll meet you halfway now instead. Or maybe that won't happen right away. Maybe it will take some time. Maybe it'll take years. Or maybe they won't. And then that will be a lot of grief. That will naturally be a space of so much grief to hold and carry and feel. And ultimately, though, this is better than maintaining that connection, because it is depleting. It is exhausting to do that. And I have found that this is the year that I can't do it anymore. I've had enough. I'm too exhausted to continue to self-abandon for the purpose of performance of a family, this performance of peace and family time. Like, my family wants us to be together, perform family, do family things, but I'm not feeling that familial bond in these ways, especially on a day like today. or on a day like tomorrow. I'm recording this a day before Thanksgiving. It's not healthy to do that. It's not healthy to self-abandon. So I've had to prioritize interrupting that pattern and that toxic cycle over keeping the peace, supposedly, quote unquote, keeping the peace within my family structure. So there's grief in that. And sometimes we need to remove ourselves from these toxic systems and patterns and situations so that we can bring our energy back to ourselves and put that into the relationships that do reciprocate, like I said before. And in a way, this is creating a consequence for the people who have relied on me to show up in this way, who have continued to rely on me to show up despite asking me to mask or put on this performance. Because when I go to these gatherings, like, I'm not happy. It feels awful. It feels awful to pretend like everything's okay when it's not, when we're celebrating a genocidal holiday and everyone's just talking about football or the weather. And there is a consequence for people treating you this way as the scapegoat, or there's a consequence for chronic invalidation. And sometimes removing yourself is the very thing that someone needs, your family or the people who are invalidating you need to realize that they're wrong or that something needs to change. So breaking these cycles is going to create friction and discomfort and a lot of grief and pain. But on the other side is it can be relieving, it can be liberating, and it can be really healing. In the moment, it may not feel good at all, but it is in the best interest of everyone for the long term. So let's break down these concepts. So first, I'm going to talk about chronic or traumatic invalidation. Then I'm going to talk about being the scapegoat. And then I'm going to talk about the concept that kind of overlaps this, which is the concept of the odd sheep. So my therapist introduced me to this concept of chronic invalidation. And it was a few days ago, like I said, that I was in therapy and I had a really good cry with my therapist about this and about being the scapegoat or the odd sheep and how damaging it can be. And I didn't realize like just how mentally, emotionally damaging this can be. And it got brought up because of all of this that's happening, but also because I had been reflecting to my therapist that something I've been struggling with for a little while is that due to a bunch of circumstances, I'm actually depressed, technically. Like, I want to speak that out loud because I want to normalize that it's okay to be depressed and you can be a functioning person who puts on purple eyeshadow and speaks into a microphone and goes about your day and smiles and makes jokes and still be depressed. And so I've been navigating a period of depression in my life. And I've also been struggling with these thoughts of like insecurity around my creative work. Like, it's been hard to write. It's been hard to put out work for Tara. And I'm up against these voices in my head that say, who cares? What's the point? Nobody's going to listen. No one wants to hear it. Here she goes again. Why does she keep talking about this? No one gives a fuck. Like, these are the voices in my head that I'm up against every goddamn day. And I'm annoyed. I'm sick of it because I want to get back to a place, the glory days of Tara, when I first started Tara and I felt like I was on fire. Like, I did not have any hesitation to put words to paper. And I was like, fucking, my fingers were spitting flames. They were typing so much and so fast. So I miss those days. I want to come back. I want to get back to that energy, but I'm navigating these insecurities and hesitations and self-doubts. And my therapist helped me to realize that these are not my voices. This isn't my voice. These are the voices, intentional or not, of being raised in a family that has chronically invalidated me. And this isn't to say that I am not loved and that my family doesn't love me, because I know that it's not intentional. But yeah, like, you can be in a family that is like, oh, we love each other, but then like you're really traumatized by them actually. And this is part of what happens when you are brought up like me in a family system that resents you for speaking the truth, for pointing out the dissonance between the family's spoken values and the actions that are actually being taken. And like, a lot of this has been done just through feeling, and it wasn't even necessarily spoken. Like, the resentment and the disapproval that I felt from my family, like, yeah, it has been verbatim at times, but I could also see it in like facial expressions or the lack of like reciprocal energy in my relationships with them. And so It's also like in the absence of encouragement for me to be myself, to shine, to be my authentic self. Like whenever I would come home and visit, but before, when I lived in so-called Portland, Oregon, I just continually felt like I wasn't being valued for who I am authentically. And that what I brought to the table was just constantly being met with like invalidation, discouragement, lack of appreciation, especially for these topics of like talking about systems of oppression and these things that I'm interested in speaking to and grappling with all the time, like, or just naturally these things come up in conversation. My family will oftentimes put it down, put my perspective down. And as somebody who studies these things and has a background in reading books about these topics and has a background in feminist theory, like I've been devalued and like dismissed because I don't have necessarily like a degree in history, a degree in politics, a degree in business or something like that. So how dare I think that I have a valid opinion on capitalism or systems of oppression or these historical events that have happened in the past or today or politics. So just being dismissed for my supposed lack of expertise when I have a huge amount of expertise in so many ways in my own way. And also a lived experience as being a queer woman in the world. And so having this continual dismissal of my expertise and perspective and voice, that is a prime example of chronic or traumatic invalidation. And this traumatic invalidation is something that can also be seen in the way that this society treats Black people, treats Indigenous people, and the impact of racism, of white supremacy, of ongoing colonization, and the gaslighting and the dismissal that our society has towards Black people, towards Indigenous people. We see this in the medical industry when it comes to not believing Black women when it comes to their pain or their symptoms. Same thing happens for Indigenous people. And the constant gaslighting and invalidating around experiences of racism, of what we call microaggressions, which really aren't micro. They're massive. They're completely harmful. They're violent. So I can't imagine the grief and exhaustion that Black and Indigenous people and people of color must feel on a daily basis. So there's this article from Psych Central that my therapist sent me. The author's name is C.N. Ferguson, and they write, quote, "Traumatic invalidation can damage your self-worth and mental health. It feels good to receive validation from those around us. This is when others recognize and affirm our feelings, experiences, and perceptions. On the other hand, it can hurt when you express your feelings only to be ignored or told that you're over-exaggerating or lying. Traumatic invalidation is when you're intensely or constantly invalidated by those around you. This can happen when your feelings, experiences, and memories are dismissed or treated as unacceptable. Invalidation may be intentional or not, but either way, it can cause symptoms of post-traumatic stress when it's severe and repeated." So we can experience this absolutely as children, but also as adults. And this article also talks about how this can have a really long-lasting negative effect on our understanding of ourselves and the world. If you're frequently told that your experiences are unreasonable, unacceptable, then it's going to be really hard for you to accept your emotional experiences. And so this can really create a huge amount of insecurity in someone. And I see that in myself. And I see this impact really coming up for review for me. For me to attend to at this time. And that's how healing works. Like, you think you got something under control, and then it comes right back up with a vengeance. And we can see how systemic oppression, white supremacy, racism, transphobia, homophobia can all contribute to this chronic traumatic invalidation too. It's this society that tells you that no, you're not really experiencing racism or sexism or homophobia. You're just being too sensitive. This can have a huge effect on mental health. And traumatic invalidation is linked to borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. It can also affect your physical health. In a 2019 study, they found that people with chronic pain often experienced traumatic invalidation by others who disbelieve their symptoms. this is why it's really important to try to seek help if you can. I know therapy is really inaccessible for a lot of people, but there are different types of therapies that can be really helpful for this. And that the article shares a list of different therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, trauma focused or CBT therapy for children, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy or EMDR therapy, psychodynamic therapy, and somatic experiencing. I've really found somatic experiencing to be really helpful for me personally. And also, I'm in therapy, like talk therapy. So let's talk about now being the scapegoat. This is also considered what's called family scapegoat abuse, or FSA. And my therapist shared with me a resource by Rebecca Mandeville, who is an expert in this topic. And the article is titled 5 Critical Things to Know About Family Scapegoating Abuse. So I'm just going to hit on a couple points here from the article. So it talks about and defines what is family scapegoating. And this article says that the scapegoat is one of the roles assigned to a child growing up in a dysfunctional family system. The scapegoating typically, but not always, begins in childhood and often continues into and throughout adulthood, although the role may be passed around to different family members at times. Because family scapegoating processes can be insidious and subtle, many adult survivors do not realize that they are suffering from a most egregious and often chronic form of systemically driven psycho-emotional bullying and abuse, with all of the painful consequences to body, mind, and spirit. So basically, being the scapegoat of your family is the ways in which your family system puts all the family's bullshit onto you, puts all the family's problems, anxieties, all the emotional, mental problems. It all just gets stuck to you and thrown onto you to carry and hold. So this article also then goes on to say that, quote, this process of projection, shaming, and blaming serves to divert attention away from the rest of the family's mental and emotional problems via casting the targeted family member into the role of scapegoat. And oftentimes, sometimes, the people in the family don't even know that they're doing this. They are completely oblivious to the fact that they are engaging in this psycho-emotional abuse. And they will become highly defensive if they point it out, which I've found in my own family. Like, I remember I was researching being a scapegoat a couple years ago, tried to introduce this concept to my family members, and it was met with invalidation. Surprise, surprise, right? So the article also talks about how scapegoating is a systemic mechanism utilized by any dysfunctional family unit to seek homeostasis. So whether it's driven by addiction, mental illness, personality disorders, individual or intergenerational trauma, or rigid authoritarianism, the act of selecting an identified patient, quote unquote, which is just another way to say scapegoat, serves another way that they're describing the scapegoat as the quote unquote identified patient. It serves as a specific function to manage the collective anxiety of the group, end quote. So as the scapegoat in your family, you're the truth teller. You're the one that's pointing out the problems and being like, hey, that's fucked up. Hey, isn't this a problem? Like, hey, maybe we should talk about this. And then they're like, you're the problem. Fuck you. What are you talking about? Stop being so sensitive. Stop being so dramatic. You're lying. No, that's not right. That's not what you're really seeing. That's not what you're really hearing. Yeah, that sounds familiar to me. And that happens all the time to me, actually, like at places that I've worked, at in my intimate relationships at times. And so this is a societal issue. I mean, the scapegoats of our society are Black people, Black women, Black trans women the most. They are the most targeted in this way in our society at large. The problem with scapegoating is that the symptoms of scapegoating often go unacknowledged or missed, even in a therapeutic setting. So a lot of adult survivors fail to realize that we're suffering from the psycho-emotional abuse that we had growing up or that we're still enduring today as adults. And even our therapists or even our counselors will miss the signs and the symptoms that are associated with being in this role. So if you are in a situation where somebody is like, oh, well, that's just family, or family's really important, or it's just best to forgive and just, keep the peace, like that's part of this reinforcement of being the scapegoat in your family. And it's part of the system that tells you that you should just put up with this abuse. It really shifted things for me when I realized that what I was experiencing is abuse and it is traumatic, and I'm not being dramatic when I say that. It's horrifying and sad, but it is something to acknowledge and talk about, and then we can move from there and heal and take different actions, take more aligned actions. But the consequences of this scapegoating are really severe. And so I just want to list a couple things from this article. It talks about that many adult survivors of family scapegoating abuse suffer from anxiety, panic attacks, depression, unrecognized grief, and anger management issues. They may be diagnosed in the past with generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and even dissociative identity disorder with psychosis. So also, in addition to this, survivors may have been diagnosed with ADHD, bipolar disorder, OCD, agoraphobia, and survivors of family scapegoating abuse are also often presenting with codependency and or addiction. This can all lead to complex trauma. The article talks about how one of the biggest obstacles to recovery is that as scapegoated adults, we don't realize that this stress, that this trauma is impacting every aspect of our lives. It's impacting our health, our emotional well-being, our relationships. It's impacting our sense of worth, and it's impacting our ability to go after our goals and our dreams. If you're constantly being told that your sense of reality is wrong and that your feelings are wrong, then you're going to grow up to think that you don't really know what's going on. You're going to grow up to be completely doubting of yourself. You're not going to feel like you belong in the places that you're in. You're going to feel like an imposter. You're going to feel like you're not meant to be where you are, that like you don't deserve the things that you want, or that, you're doubting your abilities and that you're doubting your senses and your perceptions and your perspective. And this article talks about how there's often fawning behaviors that can develop in people who are often subject to being the scapegoat of the family. So we as the scapegoat will seek to please others and avoid conflict by fawning. It talks about how where there's this struggle to go after our goals and our dreams and feel like we have a sense of purpose in the world, we might find ourselves succumbing to feelings of futility, of hopelessness, depression, anxiety, and despair. Lucky me, that's what I've experienced lately, and that I'm working out through therapy. This article talks about how the scapegoat doesn't realize that they might need to limit, or in extreme cases, cut off contact with their abusive family members who refuse to take ownership for their damaging behaviors. And so for me, I'm not in a space where I feel like I need to completely cut my family off, but I am protecting myself in this way where I'm drawing a boundary of like, I'm not coming to this family gathering. And there have been times in the past where I've realized like, okay, I can't go to this function today or this week, or I can't like attend this thing. Like I didn't go to a family wedding this last summer because I just needed it for myself. I needed my mental health and emotional health needed that. And in my family, it's been this whole conditioning around like prioritizing family above everything else and martyring yourself for the family. And like, I don't do that anymore. I'm not interested in that. So the last thing I'm going to get into is the role of being the odd sheep. Eggshell therapy is a really good resource for this. This was founded by Emmy Lowe. Emmy Lowe wrote an article titled The Black Sheep of the Family, the Meaning of It, and 4 Ways to Cope. And so Lowe writes, quote, "The black sheep of the family is someone who is marginalized, scapegoated, misunderstood. They may be particularly sensitive, emotionally intense, curious, and are wired differently. When the family has identified a person as the black sheep, all members project unwanted negative traits onto the scapegoat. Pointing fingers at the black sheep of the family is an unconscious strategy for some family members to evade their own emotional materials." So this is really kind of just echoing a lot of the things that we talked about already with being the scapegoat, but there are certain things that are just a little bit, that create a little more depth and are a little different. Emmy Lowe talks about how emotionally intense and highly sensitive people not only feel like they are the problematic ones in society, but also that they are the black sheep in the family. So we see this a lot of times with anyone who has been marginalized by society. I think it's really important to note that even if you've been cast into this role, it doesn't mean that your family hasn't expressed love for you, or it doesn't mean that your family doesn't love you, but that this is a projection from their own vulnerabilities. And it, at the same time, though, it doesn't mean that it's okay. This is all very, very wrong and unhealthy and toxic. Ultimately, casting someone in this role is a way for them to avoid their own inadequacies and to avoid the real systemic issues that the family has, as we talked about with being the scapegoat. Being cast into these roles, it can be really difficult to know who you are and live into your true essence as a person. And it's important for those of us who have been put in these roles that we realize that the family's repressed issues and anger and disappointment and shame isn't ours. It's not our responsibility, and it's not our responsibility to resolve either. Once we release this responsibility that's been pushed onto us, we can get closer to our authentic selves and we can feel more liberated and whole. There are a lot of good tips in this article, so I highly recommend reading it. Amy Lowe writes about how when you start to heal from this dynamic, if you're going to therapy or you're working on yourself, you're working on your growth, and then you go back to visit your family, or you just are like seeing your family and being around them, and like that your growth and your healing disrupts this norm of your family system. It disrupts the homeostasis, even if it is a toxic one. Ideally, your family members would be celebrating this. They would be like proud of you and happy for you. And they would want to also learn how to be better and grow as well and create a new equilibrium. But this often is not what happens. And instead, Amy Lowe writes that though unconsciously, what happens is that the family members might guilt trip or criticize you so things can go back to the way they were. These toxic behaviors can be as subtle as a disappointed expression or as forceful as a violation of your boundaries. You may end up feeling guilt-ridden, manipulated, and threatened. And so the biggest realization for me was that I was in denial of who my family is and who my parents are and what they're capable of giving me and what they're not. And so that has come with a huge amount of grief. And I realized that I've been carrying around a lot of guilt and a lot of shame for not wanting to be a part of these dynamics and these systems and pointing these things out and then being told that it's my fault or my problem. And then I had a lot of fear around telling my family that I'm not going this year to this gathering because I was afraid of the pushback, the flack that I was going to get, the guilt that I was going to receive, the feelings of guilt and shame that I feel, the guilt that I feel that if I don't go, I'm ruining the family's dinner, I'm ruining the family, I'm messing things up, and that's not true. If we didn't have a toxic family system, then none of this would be happening. And Amy Lowe talks about how deep inside, we all have a yearning for the caregivers who love, attend to, and appreciate us for who we are. We hope for parents who protect us when we feel unsafe and free us up when we need to explore. We wish for parents who are responsive to our true needs rather than imposing their own agenda. Yearning for the perfect parents is the most natural human desire that you carry from the day you are born. In usual circumstances, one's parents need not be perfect, but good enough for the child to grow up healthy and resilient. Unfortunately, many parents, due to circumstances or their own limitations, fail to fulfill their children's basic needs for love, healthy attachment, safety, and autonomy. Having to frame one of their children as the black sheep of the family likely results from the parents' limited maturity or mental strength. Even if they had not intentionally tried to harm their child, harm resulted, end quote. So even if we intellectually understand that our parents can't give us the kind of parenting that we know we desire, deserve, deeply want, we are subconsciously maybe trying to get that from them. And this can just have us in this cycle of seeking something from them that we're never going to get. And it just continues this feeling of emptiness, of longing, of pain. And yeah, it's painful to accept that our parents aren't going to be who we want them to be and can't give us what we want them to give us and that we deserve. And instead, we can go to a trusted friend, we can go to therapy, we can go to a mentor or a coach to find that fulfillment and that validation. And Amy Lowe writes that as much as possible, ground yourself in the life you have built outside of the home rather than keep trying to seek your parents' love, admiration, or approval. Paradoxically, their respect may come once you have asserted yourself. And I've found that to be somewhat true as I'm moving through this process. I mean, I'm still very much in the middle of it, but even with me just sharing like, hey, I'm not coming this year, and this is how I've been feeling. I've been feeling really isolated and invalidated and sad and unseen and unheard. And then for once, my dad responds with, well, I'm sorry to hear that, and I'm going to offer some of my own words, and I'll like watch these videos. And so there's like an opening there. So maybe there'll be an opening for you if you do this within your own situation. And maybe even if there's not, give yourself permission to feel that grief and process your feelings with a trusted mentor, coach, therapist, or friend, and start pouring that energy back towards yourself, towards building new friendships, towards building chosen family and community. So instead of going to this gathering, I'm going to be spending the day mourning, as it is a National Day of Mourning, and I'll be mourning for the original peoples who are still thriving despite ongoing colonization here, despite erasure, despite whitewashing. I'll be mourning for the earth. I'll be mourning for Palestinians, for the people of Congo and Sudan. I'll be mourning for myself and for my family, because white supremacy created this fracture in our bloodline. This fracture that I'm feeling in my chest, it feels like the worst kind of heartbreak because it's the first and it's the original. It's this familial heartbreak that precedes and informs any and all following heartbreaks that I've experienced in my adult life. And though this is painful and it feels like a shovel carving out my ribs, rewriting this current script, this so-called tradition, I think will break one of my most enduring patterns: self-abandonment. These systems condition us to self-abandon or else pay the price of rejection, of shunning, of exile. But when we choose ourselves, we find a new, fresh relief. We find true liberation. We find authenticity. And yes, there's pain and grief and sadness, but again, we can build real community. We can build new connections. We can build chosen family. I know that this is what I need if there's any chance of cultivating real, authentic, emotionally intelligent bonds in my life with my family or others. I want to break this curse of self-abandonment, and I'm exhausted of playing these roles. I do want to acknowledge that by me interrupting this cycle and this dynamic and opting out of this day, I still have the privilege of receiving their love and support. My family hasn't said, okay, you're X'd out, you're excommunicated from the family, but I have been wanting to speak to this complexity of navigating family dynamics when we feel unheard, unseen, chronically invalidated, and what serious damage these things can do. So I'm going to be spending my week and Thankstaking by channeling my energy towards reading about the true history, reading from Indigenous authors, donating to Indigenous orgs and activists, learning about Indigenous history, and visiting the Cahokia Mounds here in so-called St. Louis. I'm sending you so much love and support during this time, and solidarity and strength. And I hope that this was helpful for you in navigating your own personal family dynamics. I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear what this brought up for you, how you're navigating this time, and anything that came up for you around this episode. Please let me know. Please share it with me. You can email me at heyterracollective@gmail.com. You can send me a DM on Instagram at Terra Incognita Media. Yeah, I'm sending you so much love. All my feminist killjoy love and rage, because rage is sacred and it fuels and feeds our love for the world. It's important to feel our rage, to feel our grief, to feel our sadness, to feel our pain. And on the other side is authenticity and relief, and we get closer to liberating ourselves and each other. I will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being in this community. I'll talk to you soon.